I want you to imagine, just for a second, that you are starting a new job.
Okay.
And your employer mandates that you download this shiny new wellness app onto your personal phone, like, before you can even sign your contract.
Which is already a huge red flag.
Right. But, it seems completely innocent at first glance. You play a few resilience games on your commute. You earn some colorful digital badges for hitting milestones, and maybe you log how well you slept last night.
Yeah, standard wellness stuff.
Exactly. It genuinely feels like the company is taking an interest in your well-being. But then you suddenly realize that the answers you just casually tapped into that app about, like a rough night of sleep or feeling a little overwhelmed, are being routed directly to a management dashboard.
Wow.
And that data could literally cost you your entire career. I mean, it sounds like the plot of some dystopian sci-fi novel,
Absolutely.
but it's not. This exact scenario is happening right now, today, in the global maritime industry.
Yeah, it is a massive quiet shift, and it's happening completely out of sight of the general public.
Yeah.
We're talking about the commercial shipping industry here, the men and women who keep global trade moving across the oceans. And what we're seeing in the data is that this well-intentioned mental health support has, it's really morphed into a highly lucrative digital marketplace.
Right.
It's a system that basically commodifies a seafarer's identity. It completely erodes crew trust, and it actually weaponizes their private internal struggles against their own career safety.
And to really understand the mechanics of how this happened, we are taking a deep dive today into a really eye-opening piece of investigative work from the DeepDraft. It was written by Captain Raghu Sharma.
Yeah, it's a fantastic piece.
It really is. And it's backed by multiple academic studies, too. Like,
Right.
they cite peer-reviewed research from JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, and BMC Psychiatry. Plus, it digs deep into these really complex regulatory frameworks, like the GDPR and India's DG shipping rules. So our mission today is to investigate how this digital mental health monitoring, which, is actively marketed to ship owners as a lifeline for isolated seafarers, is profoundly impacting crew trust and actively threatening their livelihoods.
Yeah, it's a really critical issue.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand the sheer scale of the current problem, we really have to look at the historical baseline of maritime culture first.
Yeah, definitely. Because for centuries of maritime history, the mental health of seafarers was, quite frankly, completely ignored.
Just swept under the rug.
Exactly. It simply did not factor into the operational equation. You had these incredibly long contracts, profound physical and social isolation.
Right, out in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah, and the immense crushing stress of the responsibility, just keeping a massive vessel afloat and moving through hostile environments, all of that was just considered, part of the job.
Just tough it out.
Right. If you talked about stress or anxiety, it carried this massive social stigma. Support systems just did not exist. The prevailing culture was essentially to swallow your anxiety and, just tough it out.
But the pendulum has swung wildly in the complete opposite direction over the last few years, hasn't it?
Oh, entirely.
We have gone from total silence to an absolute explosion of wellness interventions. The maritime industry is suddenly flooded with, like, well-being apps, training workshops, online courses, and these highly detailed psychometric evaluation forms.
Yeah, it's a booming industry now.
And shipping companies point to these tools as undeniable proof that they care about their crew. And the vendors who build the software, they pitch them as essential safety mechanism.
Right, that's the marketing angle.
Exactly. But the source material highlights how deceptive the mechanics of this new ecosystem really are. Because these apps, they don't start out by asking for your deepest, darkest secrets.
No, of course not.
They start off super simple. They offer you fitness tips, some basic resilience exercises, and these highly gamified quizzes. They use scoring points, levels, and digital badges to push you to keep interacting.
Yeah, the gamification is key here.
Right. And younger crew members, especially who have grown up with this kind of frictionless tech, they treat it like a game. They unwittingly barter their deeply private behavioral data for, like, virtual rewards.
And the mechanism of that barter is what makes it so insidious. As a seafarer keeps engaging with the app, just to keep their streak alive or earn a new badge, the prompts slowly shift.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the algorithm starts asking about sleep patterns, emotional triggers, maybe family stress back home.
That's getting really personal.
It is. And here's how that translates into a career threat, because that data doesn't just stay on the phone. The app's backend aggregates those daily inputs, processes them through proprietary algorithms, and generates a stress baseline or a fatigue risk score.
Just boiling a person down to a number.
Exactly. And that aggregated score is then synced via the ship's satellite internet directly back to a crewing dashboard on land. So an HR manager, sitting in an office thousands of miles away, suddenly sees a red flag next to a seafarer's name.
Just because they logged poor sleep for 3 days and answered a resilience question, honestly?
Yep, that's all it takes.
It makes me think of these apps not as a supportive tool, but almost like a one-way mirror in a therapist's office.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
Right. You walk in, you sit down, you think you're interacting with this private, confidential tool designed entirely to help you better yourself. But in reality, there's a corporate management team standing on the other side of the glass in the dark, just coding your responses into a risk matrix that decides if you get a paycheck next month.
That's exactly it. And what's fascinating here is that this one-way mirror isn't even built with shatterproof glass, so to speak.
What do you mean?
Well, the sheer chaotic variety of how this incredibly sensitive data is collected and stored is a cybersecurity nightmare. When we think of digital data collection, we tend to picture like a highly secure, centralized server with heavy encryption.
Right, like bank-level security.
Exactly. But the reality out at sea is entirely different. It is not just these slick, gamified apps syncing data. Mental health information is being hoovered up through unsecured Excel files, just emailed back and forth between crewing agents.
You're kidding. Excel files?
Yes, it's being entered into clunky, outdated, visual basic forms. It's collected via basic online surveys, clinic-generated checklists, and honestly, even handwritten medical sheets at port clinics.
Wait, handwritten sheets? How does a handwritten checklist turn into a digital data liability?
Well, because a seafarer might fill out a highly invasive psychological questionnaire on a clipboard at a pre-joining clinic in, say, Manila or Mumbai, hand it over to a clerk, and that physical piece of paper might just sit on a desk. Or it gets scanned as an unencrypted PDF and emailed to a ship owner in Greece. The seafarer has absolutely no way to track it, retrieve it, or delete it.
That's terrifying.
It is. And the text points out that across all of these incredibly varied formats, whether they're digital or analog independent cybersecurity audits, are almost entirely absent.
So no one is checking if these systems are safe.
Exactly. Robust certifications or third-party penetration testing to see if these systems can be hacked. They're largely non-existent. You have software vendors claiming their app safeguards confidentiality and that only minimum access privileges are used.
Right, the usual corporate speak.
Yeah, but without verified independent audits or clear accountability for where that data flows or even enforceable safeguards, a privacy statement is not a legal shield. It is just a marketing brochure.
Wow. And extracting that sensitive data and storing it in such a chaotic, unsecured way is really only the first half of the problem.
Unfortunately, yes.
Because the narrative in these sources takes a much darker turn when we look at how this data is actively weaponized to dictate a seafarer's future. We aren't just talking about getting targeted ads for therapy on your phone here.
No, definitely not.
We are talking about your fundamental ability to put food on the table for your family.
And the regulatory landscape actually accelerated this weaponization. Let's look at the 2024 amendment by India's Directorate General of Shipping, the DG Shipping Rules.
Right.
This amendment specifically mandated mental health evaluations in pre-joining medicals. This completely changed the workflow of getting a job.
Because now they have to prove they're mentally fit.
Yes. Now, before an Indian seafarer can even be considered fit to step foot on a ship, they have to undergo mandatory psychometric testing. They must officially, legally disclose any psychiatric history, and they have to submit to highly detailed, invasive questioning about things like past substance use or past suicide attempts.
And the justification, on paper at least, is safety, right? Ensuring the crew is fit for this intense, high-stakes environment of a commercial vessel.
That's the claim, yes.
But the real-world consequence of this rule change is just chilling. The source features an incredibly stark quote from a maritime officer who looked at this new requirement and simply called it, quote, "This is just bureaucracy dressed up as therapy."
Which is spot on.
Yeah. And there is one anecdote in the text that absolutely stopped me in my tracks.
Which one?
An officer shared a diagnosis with a medical professional in what they believed was total doctor-patient confidence.
Right, as you should be able to do.
Exactly. But sometime later, they walked into a management office and discovered their crewing manager holding a piece of paper that explicitly listed them as depressed.
Oh, that's just unacceptable.
That incredibly private medical information had bypassed any standard confidentiality and leaked straight into a management risk report.
It's a complete betrayal of trust.
But let me challenge this for a second, actually,
Okay.
because if mental health data is classified as highly sensitive medical information, aren't there international frameworks that immediately shut down this kind of data weaponization?
You'd think so.
I mean, the text mentions the GDPR in Europe. Plus, we have the Maritime Labor Convention, the MLC 2006, which is essentially the International Bill of Rights for seafarers. Shouldn't those frameworks protect the listener or the seafarers from having their medical data handed over to their boss?
You would definitely assume so. But the reality of global shipping exposes why those protections are largely an illusion at sea. Let's break down the jurisdictional nightmare of maritime law.
Okay.
The GDPR does provide very strong rights on paper. It categorizes mental health as special category data that requires explicit informed consent to process.
Right.
But enforcement at sea is notoriously difficult. More importantly, the vast majority of massive merchant fleets are crewed and managed from Asia, where data safeguards are, well, at best patchy.
Ah, I see.
The text outlines these geographical loopholes perfectly. India's new law regarding this data remains incredibly vague about who actually gets to see the final psychiatric report. Japan's enforcement of data privacy is historically weak in this sector. And in major crewing hubs like the Philippines or China, the reality is that once your data is surrendered to a local crewing agency, it is essentially gone forever.
So the geography completely undercuts the law. Even if a European regulation says your data is protected, if your crewing agency is based in Manila, your ship is flagged in Panama, and your ship owner is sitting in an office in Tokyo, you have absolutely zero practical recourse if they share your psychometric test results.
Precisely. And that brings us to the fundamental flaw in relying on consent in this industry.
Because it's not really consent.
Exactly. The GDPR requires explicit, freely given consent. But we have to look at the mechanism of how that consent is obtained. How voluntary is your disclosure when your entire livelihood, your mortgage, and your ability to feed your family depend on checking a specific box on a digital form?
Right, it's basically coercion.
True consent is completely impossible when there is such a massive power imbalance between the employer and the employee. If you don't consent to downloading the wellness app, or you refuse the mandatory psychometric test, the crewing agency doesn't debate the law with you.
You just move on.
Exactly. They just hand the contract to the next person in line. You don't go to sea.
You are essentially held hostage by your own health data. And it's easy to see how that massive power imbalance, combined with the commodification of a seafarer's identity, takes a profound psychological toll on the crew.
Oh, a massive toll.
The sources cite multiple studies confirming that seafarers are now actively avoiding getting help. They are deliberately suffering in silence.
Because the risk is too high.
Right. And the core issue isn't that old-school social stigma anymore. They aren't worried about being seen as weak by the rest of the crew in the mess hall. They are terrified of losing their credentials.
Yeah.
One officer said it point blank. If people avoid the helplines and the apps because they fear losing their contracts, they know the system is watching and they know the data flows upward.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, we can actually trace the escalation of this paranoia directly to the COVID-19 pandemic.
Oh, really? How so?
The source points to extensive research published in BMC Psychiatry and PubMed that really highlights this mechanism. During the pandemic, seafarers were trapped on ships for months, sometimes over a year, beyond their original contracts because of port closures.
I remember reading about that, just stuck out there.
Yeah, communication with shore management broke down completely. And how did management respond? By increasing workplace monitoring.
Of course they did.
They were desperately trying to keep tabs on fleets from afar. And that heightened digital monitoring deeply embedded this culture of paranoia. The psychosocial reviews link all of these compounded stressors, the endless hours, the isolation, the profound homesickness, and the heavy-handed monitoring, directly to the incredibly high rates of depression and burnout we see among the crew today.
So the crew is incredibly burned out from the environment, and the industry's grand solution is to force them to download an app that algorithmically tracks exactly how burned out they are.
Pretty much.
Which leads to a fascinating mechanism mentioned in the source. Technostress.
Yes, technostress.
It's not just the stress of the job itself. It's this specific compounded anxiety caused by constant digital monitoring, mandatory app check-ins, and the pressure of maintaining a positive digital profile.
It's exhausting.
And this hits older crew members particularly hard. They often feel completely alienated by these tech-heavy systems. So instead of making them feel included and supported, this mandatory digital welfare is actually breeding deep alienation.
Yeah, it's having the exact opposite effect.
It really begs the question, how can an industry possibly function when the supposed cure, the wellness app, is actively generating more anxiety than the actual disease?
It cannot function healthfully under those conditions, and the data proves it. The tools designed to alleviate stress have become primary generators of it, simply because of how they're deployed.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. The author of the article actually compares this entire situation to George Orwell's novel, 1984.
I love this comparison.
At first glance, throwing out an Orwell comparison might sound dramatic, right? But when you look at the underlying motives and mechanics of the surveillance, the parallel is surprisingly tight.
It is a very astute comparison. Because in 1984, the omnipresent surveillance of the state was always justified to the citizens by the promise of safety and order.
Right. Big Brother is watching, but it's for your own good.
Exactly. Big Brother was watching you, but theoretically, it was entirely for your own protection. Yet the true cost of that protection was the complete stripping away of privacy, trust, and human individuality.
Wow.
Today, these digital well-being tools in the maritime industry are functioning on that exact same logic. It is a softer, more modern version of control, completely cloaked in the comforting language of care.
That's such a powerful way to frame it.
Right. It's not a camera mounted in your living room. It's a brightly colored, gamified questionnaire sitting in your pocket. But the functional result is exactly the same. Your inner life, your mood, and your stress levels are being monitored, quantified, and judged by an authority that holds total control over your economic survival.
So if the current digital marketplace of welfare is actively harming the crew and functioning as soft surveillance, then, just slapping a new privacy policy on an app isn't going to fix anything.
Not at all.
We need to completely redefine what actual functional support looks like in this industry.
A fundamental reset of the industry's compass is required. And the source text doesn't just point out the flaws. It lays out a very clear alternative framework for what real, authentic care should actually look like.
So what does this all mean? How do we actually move from a system of surveillance back to a system of actual care?
Well, the foundational shift has to be what the text calls a privacy-first approach. We have to completely sever the data pipeline between medical professionals and crewing managers.
Just cut it entirely.
Entirely. In a functional system, an employer should only ever see what are called fitness outcomes.
Meaning like a simple binary pass-fail from a certified doctor.
Exactly. A medical professional conducts the evaluation and issues a certificate that says, this person is medically cleared to sail. Full stop.
No extra details.
None. The employer, the HR manager, the ship owner, they should absolutely never have access to the raw psychiatric data or the algorithm stress scores or the daily answers from a resilience quiz. The medical details remain entirely between the patient and the doctor.
And if the employer doesn't have access to the data pipeline, that naturally forces the second major shift, right? Making all of this support completely voluntary. Because you can't coerce a seafarer into downloading a tracking app or filling out a psychological form as a condition of employment if the data isn't being used as a hiring filter anyway.
Precisely. It transforms a tool from a mandatory checkpoint back into an optional resource, which leads directly into creating crew-driven solutions.
Which means asking them what they actually want.
Yes. When researchers actually ask seafarers what they need, rather than listening to what a software vendor is trying to sell to a corporate board, the answer is remarkably consistent.
And I'm guessing it's not a new app.
No, they do not want digital dashboards. They don't want to be a fluctuating metric on an HR screen. They want confidential, shore-based counseling. They want robust peer support networks within the fleet.
Real human interaction.
Exactly. And they want independent helplines that are entirely decoupled from their employer's financial oversight.
They want human connection, not an algorithm trying to optimize their mental state. But for any of this to work, there has to be a mechanism for strict accountability. Regulators can't just write vague guidelines. They need to publish actual enforceable data use rules and severely punish companies that leak private health data.
And this raises an important question. How does an industry so deeply entrenched in efficiency, logistics, and data extraction actually shift its mindset?
That's the million-dollar question.
The author makes a compelling argument that the maritime sector must begin viewing mental health as a moral imperative rather than a business model.
Right.
Because right now there's an entire cottage industry of training consultancies, app developers, and data brokers treating seafarer anxiety as a highly profitable marketplace.
It's just exploiting their stress.
It is. And unless the industry fundamentally prioritizes human trust and medical confidentiality over data harvesting, this entire ecosystem will remain exactly what it is right now. Corporate surveillance in disguise.
Over the course of this deep dive, we've explored the mechanics of how a system built on supposedly good intentions, providing much-needed mental health support to isolated seafarers, has completely morphed.
Yeah, it really has.
By utilizing gamification, opaque algorithms, and massive geographical legal loopholes, it became a digital marketplace that commodifies human identity. It has destroyed the trust between the crew and their employers, and it has weaponized private internal struggles against the very career safety of the people it was originally designed to help.
It serves as a stark, cautionary tale about the intersection of technology, mental health, and power dynamics in the modern workplace. Because when you remove robust privacy from the equation, care instantly and almost automatically becomes control.
Before we wrap up, I want to leave you with a thought to mull over, something that builds on the underlying mechanisms we've just discussed from these sources. We've been talking about the isolated, highly specific world of global shipping ships in the middle of the ocean, where jurisdictional rules are blurry and power dynamics are extreme.
Right.
But think about the technology itself. If predictive emotional profiling, gamified psychological tracking, and algorithmic stress response scores are currently being refined and normalized right now as completely acceptable filters for employability at sea, how long do you really think it will be before this exact same surveillance model docks on land?
That's a terrifying thought.
How long before the mandatory wellness apps introduced by your own office HR department start quietly tracking your emotional triggers, and your own innermost private thoughts become the algorithmic deciding factor for your next job promotion?
The data brokers exist, the algorithms are already built, and the precedent is actively being set. It is a very real question of when, not if, this level of psychological monitoring becomes the standard across all industries.
It's definitely something to think about the next time you get a cheerful email asking you to download a fun new wellness tool for the office. We want to thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking questions, keep looking past the digital badges, and stay relentlessly curious.